I'm Carol Stewart-Grinkus, the program chair of the Sterling Garden Club, unlikely, AKA climate guru. The SGC is celebrating 89 years with the love of gardening, protection of native trees, plants and wildlife, and fostering civic beautification. This year, with the words of President Mary Roy, we are also striving to set the tone as an ecological support excuse me, by providing knowledge and resources for our community. Our monthly programs have begun our learning process, and we have these public programs. We hope that they will help you begin your tutorial. We continue our affiliation with the DCR Stillwater Interpretive Site on Route 140, with Greenways, with the New England Botanical Gardens at Tower Hill in Boylston, Massachusetts Horticultural Center in Wellesley, and the Mass Federation of Garden Clubs. You will see on our graphic poster, which we now have in the front hall, a supportive town groups whose common interests in our programs brings us strength in numbers and purpose. Bringing the students into our circle certainly enriches our learning community. Our goal tonight is to spark an urgency in all of you to find a way to make a difference in saving our planet. Stories from our in-the-field speakers will lay the foundation for your steps for you to take now, create concepts, community outreach, and careers for our next generation, who will become Earth stewards. Remember, it takes a village. So we're going to take a moment. I'm going to let the people who are going to speak first, which is the Audubon team, they will be talking, doing a presentation. They are members of the Audubon from Broadmeadow Brook in Worcester. They also run the one in Princeton at Broadmeadow. And they'll help us try to understand the nature of their services, how to protect their environment, ongoing educational projects that they have going on, and a little bit about Audubon's history. Sarah.
Thank you so
Again.
much. Good evening, and thank you so much for having us here today. My name is Sarah. I am an education coordinator out of Mass Audubon's Broadmeadow Brook Wildlife Sanctuary in Worcester. I'll be covering a bit of Mass Audubon's history and some of our current work and ways that folks, I see we have some youth in the audience, so both youth and adults and folks of any age can get involved with Mass Audubon's work. So to start off, we're going to time travel a bit back to the late 1800s when wearing feathers, real bird feathers, and whole birds' bodies in one's hat was quite the fashion, such that a feather was worth more than its weight in gold to purchase, and also such that many species were facing extinction and decimation. And also to put in a bit of context, right, we're 250 years of colonization, displacement of indigenous folks, fur-bearing mammals are also facing decimation. Agriculture has transitioned to an industrial age, so facing lots of ecological challenges as well as specifically bird species at risk. So in come two cousins, two Boston socialites named Harriet Hemingway and Minna Hall, and they organized. They did that traditional like community organizing, talk to the folks you know, gather them together, organize a boycott of feathered hats and hats that had birds' bodies on them. And that was the original Massachusetts Audubon Society. So that's, we're of course facing different, we don't still have that issue with birds being put on people's hats, but we're facing different challenges today. And yet we use some of the same techniques that they did, organizing, talking among ourselves. They advocated for legislation so that we eventually had the Migratory Birds Act protecting these species, and they conserved land. They advocated for land to be protected, and eventually we come to sanctuaries across the state. So like I mentioned, we still do some of that same work, advocacy, land protection. We also do education and outreach. And specifically, these represent some of our current focuses, including protecting and stewarding landscapes. We acknowledge that nature and the outdoors has an inequitable history in terms of access and who has experienced the worst effects of environmental degradation and who has access to the best and beautiful aspects of the outdoors. So we have a focus on equity and environmental justice, and as well, like the issue of our times, climate change, mobilizing and acting around climate change. So in terms of some of the land preservation piece, and also it's about having opportunities to connect with the outdoors. We recognize that the first step is building a relationship with the outdoors and with nature. And so this is a map of sanctuaries across the state. The ones with red dots are staffed and have visitor centers. Many of them also have accessible trails, all people's trails, that can be used with a wheelchair or a walker or a stroller, including Broad Meadow Brook and Wachusett Meadow in our central regions. The blue dots are unstaffed sanctuaries, and I'll give a bit of the highlights of 3 of the closest sanctuaries to Sterling, so within 10 miles. The closest is actually Lincoln Woods in Leominster, and this is an exciting time of year. In a few months will be an exciting time of year to visit because some of the amphibians will be making their way there, and there's some beautiful vernal pools in Lincoln Woods. So I'm right in the heart of Leominster. In, of course, Wachusett Meadow in Princeton, probably the most well-known, as it's one of our staff sanctuaries, has an all-persons trail and has woodlands, wetlands, meadows, and is on an old farmstead. And you can check out the beavers. There's a big lodge in this beaver pond, and the beavers have absolutely shaped the landscape of the sanctuary and beyond, and created habitats for other animals and plants. And in Holden, there's Eagle Lake. As the name suggests, you got that lake environment as well as woodlands, and provide some habitat in the forest canopy for some birds, such as scarlet tanagers, and if you're into flowers, mountain laurels will be blooming in a few months. So that's about some of the ways for folks to just get connected and spend time outdoors. And in terms of programs, classes, and activities, other ways to get involved, we have schools and groups. We visit schools, invite schools to visit us. We have vacation week and summer camp programs, and programs for adults. So really thinking about learners of all ages and recognizing that learning doesn't stop at any particular stage. And I'll highlight 2 of our more climate-focused programs. We have a youth climate leadership program that is targeted towards teenagers and is focused on creating space for learning, building community, and youth climate action work. So this is a photo. We had a summit in Worcester last month, and was an opportunity for folks to get together, learn about climate change, and then start developing their own climate action projects. So always the invitation is open to join that space. And for adults, we have a network called Climate Champions that similarly about networking, advocating, building advocacy skills, learning how to speak to your legislators, contact them. And I think a crucial part of both programs is that community piece, right? It's so easy to feel like we're alone sometimes in this work, but it's so crucial to be in community as we do this work. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Gabby, who's going to speak a bit about some of the insects that we have in our communities right now and are keeping an eye out for. Thank you so much.
Hi guys, I'm Gabby. I'm the TerraCorps member at Mass Audubon. It's a branch of AmeriCorps, and this year I'm doing my service at Mass Audubon Central Region. And today, one of my big projects has been focused on education efforts for spotted lanternflies But to get into that, we're also going to do a lot of talking about other invasive species so we can see the progression and how we can avoid making the same mistakes. So first we're going to start talking about the Asian longhorn beetle. And the Asian longhorn beetle was first introduced into Worcester in 2008. I'm sure a lot of you remember that being the nightmare that it was. It was awful. It came on a wood shipment in 2008 in Worcester, so we were the epicenter of that whole epidemic, which we're not super proud of, but we were involved. But it's important to acknowledge that to see how we can move forward and not make the same mistakes. So what Asian longhorn beetles do, I have some examples up front too to show, but the ways to tell is that they damage trees by eating them from the inside out, so you'll see a lot of trails within the wood and things like that. And one of the big things was that they make holes in the trees, and that was our big way of finding them and seeing which trees were being eaten. And their presence alone resulted in 27,000 trees in Worcester being cut down or killed. It was terrible, but a big reason for that was because an invasive species means that it is a species that has a habitat and has a home and thrives in its ecological environment, but when it comes here, it's introduced to a new habitat, and it might be introduced to new species to feed on, and it might feed on it too much, or it might not have natural predators to keep it from becoming such a large issue. And that's what we saw, especially in Worcester, because they had kind of a monoculture situation, which is basically when you have a lot of the same tree or plant or whatever. And it did not have a lot of diversity, so the trees that they were going after were also the host trees for these plants, or for these bugs, excuse me. And so the bugs really kind of just had a free-for-all, and so many of the trees were eligible to be eaten that the cutting down was very drastic, and you could really see the results. But currently, right now, that was a while ago, that was about 14 years ago. Right now, we're sitting in the United States, 288 square miles of quarantine areas in the United States are still active quarantine zones, and Worcester still plays a big part of that. 110 square miles of that quarantine zone, a little under half, is in Worcester alone. And the last detection of it was in July 2021. So we were sort of able to overcome that in a way, but the quarantine zones are still a precaution, obviously. But the citizens of these areas, I just wanted to emphasize it's important to not, the biggest thing for them is moving trees, wood, and firewood. So moving firewood basically just allows, if you have a tree that might have Asian longhorn beetles in them, you might not know yet because they might not have drilled exit holes, but this prevents them from being moved outside of the quarantine zone and reinfesting areas that might have recovered fully. So there was a success story though for this. They were fully eradicated in Boston in 2014, and we're hoping to see that kind of eradication in the Worcester area too. So that'll be really interesting to see, but they primarily infest hardwood trees that we have plenty of, maple, horse chestnut, birch, plane tree, poplar, willow, elm, all the beautiful trees we love to have on our property. And I have a booklet up front later on if anyone wants to come up. We have a more extensive list and pictures of what those trees might look like, so maybe you can identify them in your yard and just keep an eye out for them. And what you can do is if you see any sightings or suspect Asian longhorn beetles on any of your trees, it's important to report the sightings to Mass NRC or the Mass Department of our Agricultural Resources, MDAR. I have things for them up front. Reporting is the best way to get a handle on it so that they can do an investigation for themselves. The reason that Asian longhorn beetles were detected in the first place is because a woman saw a beetle on her tree that she didn't recognize and reported it, and they were able to find that there was actually a very large population in Worcester. So reporting is everything, because then you don't have to come to the conclusions on your own. Checking your trees and wood, obviously if you're ever going to purchase a young tree or any sort of wood, it's important to investigate it, for holes or signs of Asian longhorn beetle activities, like those little trails that they eat in the wood. And yeah, keeping an eye on your trees is a really good way to make sure that we're not overlooking possible activity. Knowing your environment too is a big way to help keep this from becoming a bigger issue. Knowing what species they prefer and what you have on your property is super, super important in keeping a handle on this and making sure that we're doing our active duty to keep invasive species from reinfesting areas. And yeah, again, don't move firewood outside of the quarantine zone because it could cause a real problem. That was one of the big problems in the first place. So now that we know about Asian longhorn beetle, an invasive species that had hit its pinnacle here and now has moved out of our area to some extent, we have a much better handle on it. We're going to talk about a new invasive species that's within our sites and that we really want to get a handle on before it becomes as big as Asian longhorn beetles. So that's the spotted lanternfly. A lot of people might have heard of it before. They did a joke about it on Saturday Night Live, which was great for PR about it. But it's an insect native to Southeast Asia, typically seen in China. It's a highly invasive hitchhiker insect, and it was declared invasive in Worcester in September 2022. So it's very recently brought here, and it's important to educate everyone in the area so that they can know the sightings of them ahead of time and how to move forward with that. So currently, they are infesting 4 major areas: Worcester, Fitchburg, Shrewsbury, and I believe Springfield. So 4 major areas are being watched and are named invasive areas. So that means they have an established population and they are on the trees that they like and they are thriving and growing. And the blue dots on the screen indicate areas of isolated sightings. So that means that they might not necessarily be an established population, but they've been sighted there, and that means that they were somehow transported, alive or dead, onto that area. Because this is a big hitchhiker insect, and that means that they cannot fly very far, but what they'll do is they'll go on anything that you're transporting, including your vehicles, and they'll try to move themselves from one place to another, and especially they'll lay their eggs on a lot of things that we might move, and they'll establish new populations that way. They're very tricky. So why are they so bad? Their feeding activity is probably the worst part about them. They feed on trees by sucking the sap out of them at excessive rates due to their large populations. And then what they'll do is they'll secrete this sugary waste product known as honeydew, and that will rain down onto the trees and can harm fruit that it's on near or leaves that it's on near. And definitely in the bottom corner we see there's a lot of, it creates a sooty mold, and that is a mold that comes from the honeydew. It grows in the base of the tree. It smells really terrible and disgusting, and it's overall not good for the health of the tree. So that could become an issue when you have younger trees in the area that might not have it as easy to survive. And yeah, they specifically feed on sweet things to them, so grapevine and trees that produce fruit. That's a really big issue for the upcoming agriculture industry. Where to find them? Their favorite species to inhabit is tree of heaven. That is a non-native species as well from Southeast Asia, which makes sense that they want to inhabit it, but we have it in very large numbers here. So it's important to know this tree, what it looks like. I have some at the table too, but this is the bark of a tree of heaven. After you come take a look at it, see if you recognize it. It grows near bodies of water. Highly invasive here too. But very big host for that. They also love grapevine, black walnut, maple, fruit trees, birch trees, anything with a sweet sap. The reproduction habits, that's what we're looking for in the winter. They've laid their eggs and they survive all through the winter, and then they hatch in the spring. They lay their eggs September to November. They'll hatch in the early summer. It's a gray putty-like surface, and it's very small in person. It's like maybe the size of your fingernail, maybe a little bigger. That's how small those are, and each will contain 30 to 50 egg masses. So they're very important to keep an eye out for. And what we recommend to do is to report all sightings to Mass NRC, especially please take a photo. That's most encouraged. Mass NRC, because it's such a new insect, they're trying to figure out how to get a handle on this, and the best way to do that is to let the professionals have control over however they choose to deal with it, because they've been researching this for a while and they're doing a good job with it so far, in my opinion. So the best thing to do is submit a photo to Mass NRC. I have lots of resources with how to do that. But a blurry photo is better than no photo, and it's just to be sure because there are so many lookalikes. Scraping egg masses when you see them into rubbing alcohol is super important, because then you prevent those 30 to 50 egg masses from hatching. Knowing your environment, again, just like Asian longhorn beetles, knowing what trees and species you have on your property makes it much easier to monitor and to know what you're looking for. And checking your vehicle. This is a new thing that they're introducing, but checking your vehicle before you leave for egg masses or live spotted lanternflies, because they're such a transportable species, is super important to make sure that we're not moving them from one town to another. Just a quick check, nothing too crazy, just to make sure that, especially if you're in an area that's an invasive area, just to make sure that we are doing our part to keep from transporting them, and hopefully can get a handle on this, so that it doesn't become a huge issue like we saw with Asian longhorn beetles. Thank you guys so much for being here.
So we have next up on the roster, in batting order, is Catherine Parent from DCR. Those of you who were here the last time have had the pleasure of meeting her. She's back with a little bit different information on how the different kinds of things that are going on to protect Wachusett Reservoir and those waters. We're going to be getting more watery as we go along with through the program. Catherine is the person that you want to get in touch with, or look on their website for the different events that go on, whether it's talks or workshops, different kinds of opportunities for folks of all different ages. She's the education queen, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, I recognize some faces in the audience from our weekend guided hikes along the reservoir. Hi. We are continuing to do guided hikes, and we have February vacation events coming up. I have a schedule for anyone that's interested. And big announcement, we have a citizens science event coming up in Drinking Water Week in May. And we're asking for volunteers to help collect water samples to check it for conductivity. And you'll learn a little bit more about that after this presentation. Before you leave tonight, you might be able to answer the question, what does this coyote decoy have to do with protecting the water?
Filtered source of high-quality water for the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority water supply system. Managed by the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Wachusett Reservoir covers 108 square miles with 37 miles of shoreline and holds 65 billion gallons of water to provide drinking water to 3 million people. That's about 40% of people living in Massachusetts. The Wachusett Reservoir was constructed during the early 1900s by damming the south branch of the Nashua River. This photo, taken in 1896, shows the rocky hilltop looking down on the Nashua River, winding its way through the valley. The same view in 1916, the valley is flooded with the waters that filled up Wachusett Reservoir. At the time of construction, Wachusett Reservoir was the largest construction project in the world. It remains a great engineering feat and is one of the few unfiltered water supplies in the country. Parts of the towns of Clinton, West Boylston, Boylston, and Sterling were flooded. Hundreds of homes, 6 mills, 8 schoolhouses, 4 churches, 2 cemeteries, and nearly 30 miles of roads and rail lines were removed or relocated. Excavation for the dam began in October of 1900 and construction continued for 5 years. Material was brought in by a cable system suspended across the valley from towers that moved along tracks. Laborers worked primarily with hand tools. Earthwork preparing the upper edges of the reservoir floor continued for another 2 years after completion of the dam. Here you see the construction of the dam in 1904. Behind the dam, the reservoir is starting to flood in the background, and the construction of the fountain that discharges water into the Nashua River in the front. At full capacity, the water spills over or sheds down the spillway and enters the Nashua River below. Depending on the amount of rainfall, season, and weather, the amount of water coming over the spillway can change. This was taken in December, and here is the same spillway in June. With the low water, you can see how the rocks were cut to mimic a natural river landscape. Today, the reservoir is filled by rainfall, snowmelt, the Quinnipoxet River, the Stillwater River, and periodically by aqueduct from the larger Quabbin Reservoir, which was built 20 miles away in the 1930s when demand for supply of drinking water outgrew Wachusett Reservoir. Not only does Wachusett Reservoir provide clean drinking water, but the watershed also provides habitat for a diverse amount of wildlife species. An actively growing, diverse, multi-age forest surrounds the reservoir. This regulates stream flow, maintains water quality, and prevents erosion. This pristine, protected environment has provided a great habitat for the bald eagles to return. Sometimes a moose will make an appearance. Moose have also returned to this diverse forest. Common loons choose the reservoir as their breeding and nesting ground. Late in the fall, loons will migrate to the coast to open water that doesn't freeze. Usually, the adults leave first while the chicks wait for their flight feathers to grow. In the early spring, loons will return from the coast. Staff build and install floating nest rafts to welcome the loons in the spring. Many kinds of birds use the reservoir for roosting. During warm weather, birds spread out over water bodies throughout the region. But as the cold weather progresses, the reservoir is the last body of water to freeze and becomes the only place to go. Some species, like gulls, ducks, and geese, will stay in large numbers for a long period of time. Up to 5,000 gulls may group together on the reservoir at this time of year. Gulls can carry and transmit bacteria and pathogens that pollute the drinking water. To protect the drinking water, the division has operated a successful bird harassment program on the reservoirs for many years. An intensive research program began in 2008 to understand gulls and mapped their habits over the course of several seasons. Data showed that gulls in central Massachusetts get most of their food from people through handouts at local parking lots. Because it's easier for gulls to get a handout, they don't eat as much of their natural food choices, and they don't get the same nutritional value. This may impact their long-term survival. Because gulls always spend the night on the water with other gulls, those feeding in parking lots in central Massachusetts often make their way to Wachusett or Quabbin reservoirs. Large numbers of gulls on any water supply negatively affect the water quality. Bacteria monitoring samples are collected routinely during ice-free conditions at 23 fixed surface locations on the reservoir. These samples are collected to document the relationship between seasonal bacteria and populations of gulls, ducks, geese, cormorants, and swans. As the number of birds increases, they are monitored and prevented from congregating on the north end where the intake is located. This is where the water leaves the reservoir for drinking water. DCR staff harass or scare away any waterfowl with pyrotechnics and lasers to get them to leave. The pyrotechnics are loud but not lethal and are launched from the shore or from a boat. The most active time of day is late afternoon until dark when birds arrive at the reservoir for the night. Typically, the season for these activities is fall until freeze over and into March and April. One other serious threat to water quality is salt. Let's hear what our environmental quality staff has to say.
Hello, my name is Jamie Carr, and I'm an environmental analyst with Mass DCR's Division of Water Supply Protection. Today we're going to talk about road salt, or sodium chloride. So the way that road salt can help us manage snow and ice in the wintertime is a really big help for public safety. However, in the Wachusett watershed alone, up to 18,000 tons of road salt are applied each year. So where does all that salt end up? It actually ends up right here in the reservoir. So once salt is put down on a road, it ends up ultimately in the waterways. We can see it and we can measure it in tributaries to the reservoir, in lakes and ponds, in the reservoir itself, and now even in the groundwater. So salt raises the salinity of water, but it's not good for fresh water and the organisms that are here in the reservoir. Zooplankton are tiny aquatic animals that live in the water. They eat algae, and they have an important role to play in keeping the water clear. It just so happens that zooplankton are one of the more sensitive species and organisms to increases in salinity. They can change the population dynamics of the zooplankton, and that has impacts on the algae and the water clarity. They're also an important part of the food chain. So if you have zooplankton and algae populations change, those are what feed the small fish, the larger fish like lake trout and brook trout, other animals at the higher up in the food chain like bald eagles and loons, and even people. And if you start causing problems in the food chain, then that's a problem for water quality. So how do we know? So how do we measure the changes in the salinity of water? Well, there's a measurement called specific conductivity. So as salt dissolves in water and takes the space in between the water molecules, it becomes better at conducting electricity. So we can use a handheld probe in the water to measure the specific conductance of the water. And it turns out that's a lot easier than collecting a sample and sending it to the lab and measuring the precise amount of chloride in the water. And the two things correlate very well. So we can get the results immediately with the handheld probe. So DWSP measures specific conductance in the reservoir, in tributaries, and in 8 groundwater wells in the watershed. For example, here is a graph of the specific conductance collected at Gates Brook, a direct tributary to Wachusett Reservoir. This is a continuous data set from 1989 to the present day in 2022. You can see that values used to fall under 500 microsiemens per centimeter. Nowadays, we commonly record values over 1,000, and even higher. You can see from the trend line that values have been increasing a lot over time. So we are now seeing evidence that chlorides are creating a long-term problem with the levels that we're seeing in groundwater in particular. So this is important to consider because groundwater is the source of drinking water for a lot of private and municipal wells in the watershed. And ultimately, those chlorides end up in the reservoir, which is the drinking water supply for over 3 million people. So what can we do to keep the amount of salt down? The Division of Water Supply Protection is committed to finding ways to reduce salt use in the Wachusett Reservoir watershed by working with local town Department of Public Works, Mass DOT, and you to come up with creative solutions to the problem of salt contamination. You may have noticed that before a winter storm, you might see trucks on the roadways applying a liquid, making the roads look wet or leaving lines on the road surface. That liquid that's being put down is known as brine, which is a mix of about 23% sodium chloride and 77% water that pre-treats the road, which actually prevents snow and ice from getting stuck to the road surface itself. This method not only keeps roads safe from the start of a weather event, but it also makes snow removal easier, and in the end, it drastically reduces the amount of salt that would be used later in the storm. Check with your town to see if they've already started or are considering using brine to pre-treat roads. Switching to brine has upfront costs in terms of new equipment, but over time can reduce costs and salt use by as much as 30 to 40%. If you do use salt at home, please do so minimally and responsibly. A 12-ounce coffee mug filled with rock salt will treat a 20-foot long driveway. Any more than that won't actually melt snow and ice any faster. Lightly pre-treating an area with rock salt before a storm is the way to go. Just make sure there's space you can see between the grains when you put it down. If there's some left over after the storm, that means you used a little bit too much this time. And if you do have some left over, you can sweep it up and use it for the next storm. That way you're saving salt and saving money. If you're up for it, you can try making your own brine solution at home in a pump sprayer. Videos are all over the internet, and they'll explain how to add straight salt to water to make your own brine. And, if at all possible, stay home during a storm. Don't expect to drive during and immediately after the storm. Give the snow removal crews plenty of time and space to make the roads safer. So while it's necessary to maintain roads in the wintertime to keep them safe for people, if we don't start doing it while using less salt, then we're going to continue to see severe impacts to aquatic life. So using salt in a smarter way, we can save money, we can still maintain public safety, we can protect the environment, and we can preserve our drinking water quality. So salt smarter and not harder.
One part that Jamie said was a 12-ounce mug of salt, of road salt, should be enough for a 20-foot driveway. So I know I always use too much salt. So if we get snow again this winter, maybe next week, you can give it a try.
Our next speaker is going to be Barbara Roberti, who has, you can't see them, but she has two hats on tonight. She is the president of the East Lake Washaycom Association, and she's also the chair of the Conservation Commission. And she's got some really interesting photos of East Lake Washaycom. She has some suggestions on ways that you can protect the lake, but she also has a handout that I was helping her with that really applies to everybody, because we all live in a watershed, the land that drains into one common area. And whether you live on a lake or near a pond or near a stream or river, we're all connected. And so we've got some very specific actions that you can take that will help protect groundwater as well as surface water for people and all the other organisms that depend on it.
Right now, Shelley is going to show some pictures. These are the old pictures. If everybody remembers that East Lake Washaycom and West Washaycom was one lake. It was called Washaycom Lake back then, and it goes back into the late 1800s and the early 1900s that we know of a record of. So at random, some of the pictures Shelley will show us as we go along, and you can see what it looked like. I'd like you to move along now, Shelley, to show some of the, these are some of the cottages, and people in Boston came to the West Lake to get away from the heat. So they came up on the trains and they spent the summers there. And as well, it was the Mennonite churches that did their services there and turned into, that's a little camp at the end. There was what they call a yacht and a steamship that took people around from West Lake to East Lake, at that time called Washaycom only. And they showed, there's the island, if you remember, on West Lake. And they show different people, the different animals, the birds, etc. And this thing ran every half hour or so, and it only cost like 5 or 10 cents for adults and children to take a ride around the lake. And they left at a certain time, the bells would ring and people would go down to the wharf and get onto the steamship and go around. I'd like to also mention at this time, back in the Indian days, there was a nautical law spent on East Lake Washaycom. There was King Philip's War was running with the Indians, and they actually had a naval battle on East Washaycom in their canoes. So I didn't ever find out who was the winner, but that actually occurred. So if you ever want to tell somebody from someplace else that your tiny little lake in your beautiful little town of Sterling had a naval battle, it's the truth. King Philip's War. So now there's the pavilion. I didn't think we had a picture of the pavilion because that is really kind of a brand new picture that people are finding on old glass pictures that their parents saved. So this is really nice to see that pavilion there. And this is where they waited for the steamship to come in and to get on the yacht and take their trip around the lake. They also had a lot of wonderful activities, as you can see. There's your prices, 10 cents and 5 cents for children, round trip 15 cents. I guess you might do a round trip because I don't know how you're going to get back. It's a long swim. But anyways, and they had a bowling alley, and you'll see some of the pictures as they go along, as well as a skating arena and a restaurant, and anything that you could possibly think that you'd like to find in a resort was there. So they had a wonderful time during the early 1800s. There you go, with the captain and the flags flying. And that was, I think, considered the yacht. So I hope you enjoy those pictures. There it is, going off, taking everyone for their 5 or 10 cent ride and the 15 cent round trip, because you ended up, I believe, over at the town beach in West Lake and East Lake, and that would be a long way to getting back to where you came from. So round trip was the way to go. And as we go along, you'll see more and more pictures of the different sites that they saw and the different buildings that were there, and everybody having a great time on the lake. And as a result of the lakes being divided, and I'll let the pictures run and you can just look at them. As a result of that, the people on East Lake did a lot of complaining because when the reservoir was built in the early 1900s, and the early, in 1930 or so, when the reservoir was built, they closed down both lakes. It was considered one lake at the time, and there was no recreation allowed on either lake. So at that time, like I said, it was one big lake, and that's when the uprise came from the people that enjoyed using the lake for recreation, such as boating and water skiing and things like that. And that's when it got divided. It was because of outbursts by people, that went out and complained about the fact that they couldn't use the lake any longer. And so the East Lake and the West Lake became two different lakes, and it was cut off. Now, up until even recently, you could actually take a kayak down one of the tributaries that comes from East Lake to West Lake, West Lake to East Lake rather, and you can still follow that route where that originally was connected. And that's over by Dr. Blodgett's house, if anybody remembers over there. Yeah. There's a tributary there, and that's the one that came from West Lake to East Lake. So anyways, at the time, like I said, it was quite a big lake. Now divided, East Lake Washaycom is 200 acres, just a little under 200 acres. And of course, activity is run all the time on that lake. We have tried very hard in the past to get an association going, which we have successfully done. And our charter basically is to protect the lake for the next generation. It's going to be here for me, and it's going to be here for almost everybody in this audience. Maybe some of those little kids in the back will have a lot to worry about. But we want to make sure that it's there for you. We want to make sure that we do the best we can to be good stewards of it. And so that is our charter, and that's what we work very heavily with. We are very sorry that in this day and age that we didn't know as much as we know now. Back in the days when people started building houses on the lake and turned camps into full-time homes, they cut down all the trees so they had a beautiful view of the water. They didn't realize how ignorant this really was. Now, the Lake Association, along with the Conservation Commission, demand that if you take down any of these trees because they are unhealthy or they're dead, and those are the only reasons we'd like to see them taken down, is that you replant. You put in something that's native, and whether or not, even if it's blueberry bushes, put in a few blueberry bushes to help with the runoffs that come into the lake from the animals and everything else. There are 7 tributaries to East Lake Washaikan, and we take very good care of all of them. 30 years ago, when I became president of the Lake Association, so see, it's really time for me to retire and find somebody else. We had our first algae bloom, and that was a horrible thing. And one morning, everybody woke up and the lake was green. Now, this was just horrible. Nobody knew what to do. And I was vice president, just in charge of having a good time, like all the presidents before me. So I had to find out what to do. And anyways, I found out that, you know, there was only one company in Massachusetts, and it was, at that time, Aquatic Control Technology. And they were the only ones that were licensed in the state of Massachusetts to help out with people that were having algae blooms. We didn't even know what it was called when it happened. So anyways, we had hired them to come in and do lots of treatments to our lake and to determine what was going on with it, what was invading it, what was happening. And so from there on in, every single year, we have had a company. We haven't always had them because they dissolved and other companies have taken over. But we have always been 100% in fair treatment of the lake. Now, we have come to the town, and you have always been so wonderful to us on our warrants, asking for some funds to help us. The Lake Association pays half, and the town has always voted to pay the other half of treatments that are required to keep the lake in pristine condition, and it is in pristine condition. Now, that costs us approximately $20,000 every year. We know that we don't want to continue with treatments and chemicals. We know that this is not the ideal situation. So we've tried some new things too. One of them is Euro pillows. The Lake Association has taken that cost on completely, and last year we spent $9,000 on these Euro pillows that sit in our tributaries, trying to collect whatever is being run off into them. It's going to count phosphates and other bacteria that might be coming down out of the tributaries, which is the watershed. So like Marion said, the most important thing is not if you live on the water itself, but that if you're in the watershed areas of different lakes, ponds, streams, etc., it all eventually ends up where you don't want it to be. So therefore, we make it a habit, like I said, of making sure that all these tributaries are cleaned and watched and tested every single month once the water starts to run. And again, we do the Euro pillows. Like I said, we didn't get much information last year. If you remember correctly, it didn't rain. And so all of our money for the $9,000 for the Euro pillows really went to waste. But because of that, we decided that we'd go ahead and try it again this year. If we don't get any valuable information this year, we will discontinue that. But it is in order for us to tell people that we don't want to treat with chemicals if we don't have to. And we certainly wouldn't go beyond what a licensed company is telling us how to treat with chemicals. So everything is done perfectly by permitting and with the Conservation Commission and votes taken by both and contracts that are written up ahead of time, and everything is done ahead so that you know just what's going into the lake and when it's going in. It will go on television now, to our local television, to tell you when the lake will be treated. Most of the times that we close down the lake for treatments, it's really not a necessary thing, but we would like for the treatment to have its best effect. So to keep boats and people out until it can do its best work, the chemicals that we are putting in there. Most bang for our buck, more or less to say. They're not dangerous chemicals to you or anybody else that might want to put their feet in the water or their dog jumps in the water. You don't have to really worry. But I'm just letting you know that that's why we closed the lake down. And we make sure that recreation knows and everyone else knows and everybody else is aware of that happening. We also have on my table over there, Miriam was so good to make out a whole bunch of things that are in our lake book. When somebody new moves into the lake, because we were all so uneducated, myself included, 30 years ago, now we send out what we call a welcoming package, and in it is a lake book. That book tells everybody on the lake what we'd like you not to do. We don't have any power to demand it, but we ask you to use no fertilizer if possible, and if you insist that you need some, to please use what they call a better suited fertilizer, which is slow release and helps basically with the lake a little bit. We ask you to pump your septic systems. Every 2 years anyway, but if you really want to be careful, every year would be best. We ask you not to feed the geese and not to feed the ducks, even though they are so cute when they're little, and it's very hard to do that. But that is what we basically do, and try to keep everything so the best that we can, like I said, for the next generation that will be coming around. I think the pictures have all shown through, and everybody, I hope, enjoyed those to see what it was like a long time ago. And on my table, too, there is a report of everything that we hired. What we're working with now is a company called Water and Wetlands, and their report is there for what they're going to do for 2023 for the lake. We will come to the warrant on the meeting for half of the money for it. And we also, I mean, if we get turned down, we will do our best to pick up the whole bill, but we need everybody's help. And remember, this is an absolute jewel for the town of Sterling. And we are doing the best that we can as a Lake Association and a Conservation Commission to keep it that way for the next generations. If you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them when this is over. So, thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for some questions, if people have any questions for any of the speakers.
Barbara,
Yes.
because I mentioned the word addling, which is such a weird word, would you just say a minute about what it is?
Yeah, I will.
Thank you.
And I have some additional information that I got in the last 2 days.
Okay. As where's the microphone? The DCR this year was speaking with us, so Catherine has brought this coyote, as you can see, which is there to help get rid of different geese and problems like that. But I'd like you to know the Lake Association as well does a lot with deterrence. We have what they call a distressor that people are really scared of themselves, never mind the birds. It screams so loud. And we just purchased that. I think we paid $250 for it. But if we find it successful, we'll buy more. We've used the bangers. We've used all that sort of thing too, because as you know, one goose can put so much bacteria into the water. It's really scary. But now, this year, the thing that has been recommended by different scientists is that we addle the eggs. Well, I thought that was a great thing because they won't hatch. So we don't have the...
Tell them what you do.
Yeah, you have to... The flotilla of geese that we had last year kind of said to us, let's try not to get the geese to start with. So, of course, addling the eggs will kill the babies that are in there.
They want to know what the word addle.
Addling means that you pick up the little egg and you shake it. And that way it kills the embryo inside of the egg. But it doesn't keep the goose from laying more eggs. If you take the eggs out of the nest, she'll just come back and lay more. And so you defeat the purpose. So now by addling the eggs, of course I thought that, oh yeah, we'll do that. We'll apply for a permit for that. And then we'll hire a licensed addler.
And that's where I come in.
And that's where she came in. And she said, what licensed addler?
So full disclosure, my name's Marion Larson and I used to work for the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife until last March when I retired after 38 years. And when she told me about this, I said no, licensed addlers. However, I promised her that I would speak to our waterfowl biologist who fell through the ice at Great Meadows last week, idiots. but that's how he rolls. Anyway, I have more information. The addling, what you're doing is you're messing with the airspace that's inside the egg and preventing the air exchange, which is what, there is air exchange in those shells, but you're messing with that. And yeah, you're doing a little bit of scrambling, as it were. And what I learned was, and you have to do it at a certain time anyway, and because they're only laying eggs at a certain time, but our biologist explained that geese are not as likely to re-nest as I had originally thought. But if you what he said was in the eastern part of, the western part of New York, they did a bunch of destroying of nests. So I think if you just take the eggs away, they're going to re-nest. Well, they were destroying those nests, and the birds actually flew north a little bit, north, away from where they had been nesting, to then molt, because all geese molt and can't fly for a certain period of time. Same thing with ducks. But in Massachusetts, being as close as it is to the coast, apparently those geese, when they tried doing that, they put they put radio collars on the geese and tried the same thing. They did not leave the area because the biologist was like, oh, they're leaving in the summer and going elsewhere. We're not going to have complaints in Massachusetts about golf courses and lakes and docks and things like that. So that doesn't work. But having the eggs addled, shaken, you can poke a hole in them too. I found that out. And he also said he does know some people that you can designate as egg addlers.
Oh, great.
And so he's going to give me that information.
Wonderful.
But there may be people who are willing to do it. And but the thing is, you need to find the nest, and sometimes the nests are in some pretty difficult places to go.
Yeah. We pretty much know where
But
ours are.
he's going through the permits right now.
I will, yeah.
And I told him, watch for the East Lake Washington one, and he's going to send me some information on those folks.
Okay.
So another.
Volunteer to be an adler, you can report to Barbara.
And I have links to how you do it.
I have a question. Why destroy all the eggs? Why not just leave two? Or one? The loss of the waterfowl may, that could have unintended consequences, don't you think?
Well, the intention, and I will then give you a little more history, these are all birds that are related to birds that used to be kept by waterfowl hunters in the days when you could use a live duck or a live goose as a decoy to bring in the ones that were migrating. Those geese were taken care of for generations and generations, and when some of those laws that our speaker from Audubon talked about were passed, some of the laws and there weren't a lot of laws, which is another reason why everything was getting decimated, was you have certain hunting seasons set up, and that's it. You used to be able to hunt in the spring and the fall. Then they said, no, just fall. But there are certain regulations in place now. These geese that we're seeing all summer are descendants of those birds from those folks that were using them for hunting. Because once those laws were passed saying, thou shalt not use live birds for decoys, what's the point of feeding them all? So what did people do? Well, they let them go. And they were thriving because they like grass and green things. And then people got the idea, hey, let's have some Canada geese in other parts of the state, because they were mostly on the coast. And the birders, the Auduboners, the hunters are like, oh yeah, let's do this. So the agency I worked for said, okay, let's do this. Go catch geese, put them in other parts of the state. Knew what was going to be happening, just like unintended consequences. And over time, and our biologist waterfowl guy has been with us forever, since the early 1970s, and he said, wow, I think there's going to be a problem. Then he knew when there was going to be a problem when we got lots of phone calls over time. But it took years for the population to build up. Long story short, he had to do some more research and this was happening all over the Northeast.
So they're like, okay, we gotta shoot more geese. But the thing that the agency was trying to do is there's two populations in Massachusetts. There's the resident descendants, as it were, year-round, and then there's the population of Canada geese that actually live up in Canada and nest up there and migrate through Massachusetts, and some of them are starting to winter over in the south, in the Cape and Islands, as well as the mid-Atlantic. Well, the states were all saying, yeah, but we got all these resident geese and thousands and thousands. I mean, I don't know, in 1995, 38,000 geese easily. The resident. So what they did was said, let's set up some hunting seasons that target those resident geese early before the usual and late after the usual, so that you're not catching the birds, which were having some population problems up there. It's a lot harder to raise geese in the north where it's really terribly cold and there's not lots of lush lawns and bird seed or whatever, you know. So we had to do research and collar them and show the federal government, who has control over the migratory birds and that Migratory Bird Act, to say, hey, if we do it this way, and they said, you know, okay, this makes sense. So it's not the presence of geese, it's the problem. It's the numbers. And believe me, you're never gonna get all the eggs or find all the nests. There's just no freaking way. There's just no way. You're not, you know, this is all figured out to make sure there's always geese, but man, we need a whole lot less. Because a pound, what is it, half a pound?
Yeah.
Half a pound of poop a day.
Yeah.
So that's the long answer to what's going on, and this is one of many things. Decoys help, you have to move them around. Geese are smart, it's like scarecrows. The crows finally figure out the scarecrows aren't so scary. Same thing with the decoys, but you have to use a variety of techniques, and nothing is guaranteed. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.